Have you ever felt out of place in a place where it seemed like no one wanted you to be there? Imagine starting a new job, full of enthusiasm, but instead of a welcome, you are met with dismissive looks and nasty comments. This is the reality of Julia, a determined nurse who arrived at St. Mary's General Hospital with the mission of helping people. However, she soon realized that not everyone was ready to welcome her. Julia faced prejudice from all sides, but the most difficult thing was dealing with a doctor who only saw her for the color of her skin. Every day, she felt more anxious, not knowing what awaited her. Imagine waking up every morning with the weight of uncertainty, not knowing if you could handle what was coming. Get ready for a story full of challenges, courage and a surprising twist. The morning sun illuminated St. Mary's Hospital, in its shiny glass windows. I, Julia Parker, was about to take the first step into this new chapter of my life. With his badge pinned to his impeccable uniform, he felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness as he walked through the main entrance. The aroma of alcohol and antiseptic soap was familiar, always reminding me of my purpose, to care for people. Julia, right? The voice interrupted my thoughts. I looked at a nurse with blonde hair and blue eyes, who was watching me with a smile that seemed not entirely genuine. Yes, it's me, I replied, trying to maintain confidence. It's my first day. She nodded, but her eyes assessed me, as if she were deciding something. I hope you're ready for what's coming. This place can be challenging. I thanked him, apprehensive but determined, and moved on. The hallway was long and white, decorated with abstract art that I couldn't appreciate. As I walked, I noticed the heavy silence among the employees. Some nurses huddled together, while others just stole glances at me. The tension was palpable, and a chill ran down my spine. It was as if I was being observed not just as a new recruit, but as an intruder. Come on, Julia, you can do this, I murmured to myself, remembering my mother's encouraging words, you are strong, you are capable. The echo of his voice still resonated in my mind, a mantra I would repeat with every step in the ward. Finally, I found a group of nurses around the nursing station. With a nervous smile, I approached. Hi, I'm Julia. I'm starting today. Hi, a curly-haired nurse replied, but quickly looked away, as if I had interrupted something important. The other nurses just nodded, but their responses lacked warmth. An awkward silence settled in, and I felt like a fish out of water. This feeling wasn't new to me, but I hoped I wouldn't have to face it again. Are you ready for the long shifts? Asked an older nurse, with a critical look. Here, we really work. Of course, I replied, trying to sound excited. I look forward to learning and helping in any way possible. Great, she said, but her tone didn't reflect enthusiasm. Just don't be surprised if things get difficult. Some people aren't so welcoming. I didn't need any further explanations to understand what she meant. The atmosphere in the hospital was already clear to me. The hostility and prejudice were invisible, but they were there, like a specter that hovered over us all. Still, I knew I couldn't let it get me down.
My objective was clear, I needed to prove that I deserved to be there. Upon entering the break room, I found a group of doctors and nurses chatting animatedly. They didn't notice me, and I refused to interrupt. Dr. William Andrew, one of the hospital's most respected doctors, was laughing at a joke someone had told. I had already heard some things about him, and they weren't good. What worried me most was his look. He was known for being direct and often harsh, and from what I heard, he didn't have much patience for newcomers. However, I needed to face him. So I took a deep breath and approached. Hi, Dr. Andrew, I'm Julia Parker, the new nurse. I'm looking forward to working with you. He turned around slowly, sizing me up and down, which made me feel like I was being subjected to an examination. Ah, yes, the new one. "Let's see what you can do," he replied, his voice full of disdain. The other doctors laughed lightly, and my heart sank. It was clear that Dr. Andrew had no intention of giving me a chance. However, I couldn't allow myself to be shaken. With every look I received, with every whisper I heard, I remembered my mother's words: "People will try to bring you down, but you must stand up and show who you are." The day was slow, filled with administrative tasks and some interactions with patients. Most of them didn't seem to care about the color of my skin, but the looks from my colleagues spoke louder. I was in a constant internal battle between maintaining my professionalism and dealing with the hostility that was manifesting itself in subtle but incisive ways. When I finally got home, exhausted, the first thing I did was call my mom. "Hi, honey. How was your first day?" Your melodious voice lit up my heart. "It was challenging," I replied, hesitant to share all the details. "I feel like I'm being watched all the time, and some nurses don't seem very open to getting to know me." "Julia, you always knew the path would be difficult, but you have incredible strength within you. Don't let others define your worth. You are a talented nurse, and don't forget that." My mother's words were like a balm for my soul. "Thanks, Mom. I just need to stay strong. I can't give up now." "You'll never give up, sweetheart. Remember, you're there to make a difference, and people need you." I disconnected the call with a smile, feeling a little more empowered. I knew the fight was just beginning, but with my mother's support and the certainty of my purpose, I was determined not to let prejudice bring me down. Tomorrow would be a new day, and I was ready to face it with all the courage I possessed. The days at St. Mary's General Hospital began to drag on, each one heavier than the last. The hostility he faced daily seemed like a constant shadow, and the figure of Dr. William Andrew stood out as the main source of this torment. It was as if he had a personal mission to make me invisible, an obstacle in my journey as a nurse. Every time we crossed paths, his expression revealed contempt and indifference. I wondered if he got a kick out of it, if he took pleasure in putting me in challenging situations while his white colleagues were treated more kindly. One morning, as I was getting ready for my shift, I overheard Dr. Andrew talking to some nurses in the cafeteria. The tone of his voice was harsh, and it was impossible not to pay attention. "That new nurse doesn't have what it takes to be here," he said, pausing to let his words hang in the air. "They say she's good, but what I've seen of her doesn't convince me. We need professionals who really know what they're doing." The nurses around him laughed, and it made my heart sink. It was difficult not to feel affected by his words, as if each laugh was a deep cut in my self-esteem. When I arrived at my station, I was assigned to a patient who could be described as difficult. Mr. Johnson was a middle-aged man with a perpetually crossed look. As soon as I entered his room, the tension was palpable. "What do you want?" he snapped, without even looking at me. "I'm here to take care of you, Mr. Johnson," I replied, trying to remain calm. "I need to check your vitals." He turned around, looking at me with contempt. "You, a black nurse? What do you know about care?" I swallowed hard, feeling anger and humiliation mix in my chest. I took a deep breath and said, "I'm a qualified professional and I'm here to help you." I tried not to let my tone betray the emotion bubbling inside me. Mr. Johnson let out a sarcastic laugh. "Qualified? Don't make me laugh. What do you know about being a real patient? You're nothing but a second-rate nurse." With a heavy heart, I went about my work, measuring his blood pressure and checking his heartbeat. He continued to hurl nasty comments, but I decided I wasn't going to let it get to me. "Mr. Johnson, I understand that you are going through a difficult time, but I am here to ensure that you receive the best care possible," he said, trying to maintain a professional demeanor despite the hostility. After a treatment that seemed to last an eternity, I finally left the room exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. I knew it was just another day in a sea of challenges, but that meeting had been particularly difficult. At break time, I sat in a secluded corner of the cafeteria, trying to compose myself. The smell of coffee and fresh bread couldn't hide the bitter taste of Mr. Johnson's words. As I tried to distract myself, I heard familiar voices. "She has a way of dressing that is not appropriate for a hospital," said a nurse, with contempt in her voice. "And you still have the audacity to think you can teach us something." The collective laughter that followed made my stomach turn. It was difficult to believe that, in the 21st century, discrimination was still so evident, so rooted in an environment that should be one of care and empathy. I decided I needed a moment to myself. I got up and left the cafeteria, going to the hospital garden. It was a small space, but it brought me a little peace. Soft sunlight filtered through the trees, and birdsong seemed a reminder that there was beauty in the midst of hardship. As I took a deep breath, I remembered my mother's words, "You are strong, Julia. Never let anyone make you feel inferior." That advice echoed in my mind and, for a moment, I felt a wave of determination. I was there for a reason and I wasn't going to let prejudice get me down. But how could I fight a system that seemed so aligned against me? The question lingered in my mind as I returned to the hospital, knowing that my next shift awaited me. Upon entering again, I was called to see Mr. Thomas, a patient who had been hospitalized for a few days. He greeted me with a genuine smile, which surprised me. "Ah, you're the new nurse, aren't you?" he asked, his friendly expression breaking some of the tension I was carrying. "My name is Thomas," he said, extending his hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "Nice to meet you, Mr. Thomas," I replied, feeling a little lighter at being treated with respect. "How are you feeling today?" He looked at me with genuine interest. "Better, thanks to you. I've heard some things about what you've been going through here, and I just wanted to say that I admire your courage." I was speechless, surprised by the empathy he showed. "Thank you, Mr. Thomas. It's a challenge, but I'm here to do my job to the best of my ability." He nodded and began to share some stories from his life. Every word seemed to bring a little light to my day. It was refreshing to find someone who saw beyond prejudice and discrimination. "You shouldn't let other people's negativity get to you," he said, looking into my eyes. "You have a purpose here, and it's important that you embrace it. The world needs people like you." Hearing this from someone who was facing their own struggles gave me a new boost. At that moment, I realized I wasn't alone. There were people around me who saw injustice and were willing to fight against it. The conversation flowed naturally, and as I tended to him, I noticed that the mood around us seemed to change. The respect and dignity he demonstrated was an antidote to the hostility I often faced. As I left Mr. Thomas's room, a new determination began to form within me. I might not have control over the actions of others, but I did have control over my response to them, and that in itself was a powerful form of resistance. Sitting in the chair next to Mr. Thomas's bed, I felt a mixture of relief and gratitude. He had become a refuge amidst the chaos that surrounded me. The connection we developed was a light in the shadows of an environment filled with hostility. At each visit, he seemed more interested in my life than the doctors around me. "Julia," he began, his deep, comforting voice filling the room, "you know you're an excellent nurse, right?" His eyes, a bright blue, reflected sincerity. "Don't let others make you doubt that." "Thank you, Mr. Thomas. This means a lot to me, especially now," I replied, trying to hide the fragility in my voice. The contempt I faced daily piled up like an unbearable weight on my shoulders. "Sometimes I feel like I'm fighting a battle alone." He leaned forward a little, his eyes fixed on me. "You're not alone, Julia. Sometimes people project their insecurities and fears onto others, but your determination is what really matters. I took a deep breath, seeking strength in his words. I responded. It's difficult, Mr. Thomas. Dr. Andrew seems to take particular pleasure in putting me in sticky situations. He treats me as if I'm incompetent. I saw this, and it is unacceptable, he said, his voice firm. But you must remember that what he thinks or says does not define who you are. You have immense value, not just as a nurse, but as a person. It's easy to say, I replied, but with every sideways glance, every subtle comment, it seems like they're always trying to bring me down. Frustration dripped from my voice. I just wanted them to see me for who I am, not as a black nurse in a predominantly white hospital. I understand you, he replied. Prejudice is a daily fight, and it becomes exhausting. But this fight isn't just yours, it's a battle many face. He paused, as if weighing his words. Believe me, you are making a difference, even if it seems small. Your presence and determination have an impact, and that is important. His words were like a balm for my soul. The connection we developed gave me strength, but at the same time I knew that the environment around me remained hostile. Each day, I felt the weight of microaggressions. A nurse passed me in the hallway and whispered something to her colleague, making them both laugh. My heart sank, and I forced myself to ignore it, but the pain of exclusion was palpable. That day, after visiting Mr. Thomas, I went to the nurses' break room. As soon as I walked in, the mood instantly changed. Conversation stopped, and short, dismissive glances were thrown my way. The tension was almost palpable. Look who decided to show up, one nurse commented, with a tone of sarcasm that made me feel like I was being sized up. The hospital's new star. Anger began to bubble up inside me, but I took a deep breath, trying to hold myself together. I knew I couldn't let these provocations shake me. I'm just here to get some coffee, I replied, trying to remain calm and avoid unnecessary confrontation. Well, you know you're not welcome here, don't you? Another nurse joined the conversation, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Perhaps you should consider a new job, one where your presence is appreciated. My heart raced, and I could feel the moisture in my eyes, but I didn't want to show weakness. I'm here to take care of patients, and that's what I'll continue to do, he said with a firmness he didn't feel inside. Take care of patients or prove yourself better than the rest of us, she retorted. I'm not here to compete with anyone, I'm just doing my job, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Your work is attracting too much attention, Julia. Don't forget your place, said an older nurse. A wave of indignation invaded me. My place is here, just like yours. We are all here to help the patients. I told the truth, burning in my throat. But in doing so, I realized I was just putting myself in an even more vulnerable position. The nurses exchanged glances, and the tension in the air was palpable. I left the room quickly, feeling the humiliation that conversation caused me. As I passed reception, I saw Dr. Andrew talking to a team of doctors. He made a dismissive gesture when he saw me, as if I wasn't worthy of being there. My heart sank. Julia, he called, and I turned away, trying to hide my dismay.
Before I continue, I need to tell you something. Do you want to attract a lot of money into your life? Check out the powerful and secret Tesla ritual that I will leave in the first pinned comment, and start transforming your financial life. Let's continue.
It seems like you're getting involved in some controversy, doesn't it? Did that nurse tell you something you didn't like? No, Dr. Andrew, I'm just here to do my job, I replied, trying to maintain my composure. Ah, yes, your job, he said, sarcasm dripping from his voice. Let's see how long you can stand this. And then walked away laughing with his colleagues. I felt anger boiling inside me, but I was determined not to let it get me down. Upon entering Mr. Thomas's room, he quickly realized something wasn't right. "Julia, you seem shaken. What happened?" he asked, his sincere concern making my heart warm. "Just another hard day at work," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, but the tears started to threaten to escape. "Sometimes we need someone to believe in us. Don't let them make you doubt your worth," he said, and his words deeply touched my heart. "Thank you, Mr. Thomas. You can't imagine how much this means to me," I replied, sitting on the edge of the bed. "If you need to vent or discuss anything, I'm here. And please don't give in to them. You are stronger than you think," he added, with a serenity that brought me comfort. That conversation gave me new energy. I knew I had to keep fighting not just for myself, but for everyone facing the same type of discrimination. There was a clear purpose in my fight, and that was what kept me going. Mr. Thomas became my ally, my support in a world that seemed to be falling apart around me. Even though the journey promised to be long and challenging, I was determined not to give up. The day started like any other, but a sense of urgency hung in the air. I was called in for an emergency operation, and my heart started racing. It wasn't just the adrenaline of the situation, but also the fear of being under Dr. Andrew's critical eyes. Upon entering the operating room, the smell of alcohol and the sound of surgical equipment filled the environment, creating an atmosphere of tension. At the table was a middle-aged man, with a serious clinical condition. The team organized quickly, and I prepared myself for what was to come. Responsibility weighed on my shoulders, but determination drove me to move forward. "Julia, take the scalpel and prepare to incise," ordered Dr. Andrew, his voice as cold as steel. I knew that under his orders, any slip-up could be fatal. I tried to stay calm, focusing on my breathing, while he focused on the monitoring screen. It was then that I realized something wasn't right. The patient's vital signs were fluctuating dangerously. "Dr. Andrew, oxygen levels are dropping rapidly," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. He gave me a contemptuous look. "I know what I'm doing, Julia. Don't interrupt me," he replied, with a tone that made it clear he didn't want to hear my concerns. But the feeling that something was wrong didn't leave me. The patient didn't respond as he should have, and I knew that if Dr. Andrew didn't change his approach, we could lose this life. The pressure increased, and the room seemed to shrink around me. The urgency of the situation made me feel like every second passed like an eternity. I remembered Mr. Thomas's words, which always encouraged me to be a defender of what was right, not to remain silent in the face of injustice. With a surge of courage, I decided to act. "Dr. Andrew, the patient's blood pressure is dropping. We need to increase fluid intake immediately," I stated, my voice firmer than ever. His gaze hardened, but the urgency of the situation did not allow me to hesitate. "You are not responsible here, Julia," he shouted. But I couldn't afford to back down. "I know I'm not responsible, but I'm a nurse, and that can make the difference between life and death. Please trust me," I begged, feeling the heat of the fight rising inside me. He hesitated, and I could see a hint of doubt in his eyes. The tension was palpable. I knew what I was doing could cost me my job, but I couldn't let a patient die out of pride. His life was in my hands, and I was determined to fight for it. A quick gesture, and he signaled for us to increase fluid administration. The seconds dragged by, and with each drop that entered the patient's vein, I felt my heart accelerate. The team followed my advice, and slowly his vitals began to stabilize. Soon, the atmosphere in the room changed. Dr. Andrew was silent, his expression a mixture of frustration and reluctant recognition. I knew that despite the momentary victory, the battle was far from over. When the surgery finally came to an end and the patient was taken to the recovery room, a deep sense of relief washed over me. However, the tension between Dr. Andrew and I was far from dissipating. "You were lucky this time, Julia," he murmured, his voice low and full of anger. "But don't think that changes anything. You're still new here and have no idea what you're doing." "I saved a life, Dr. Andrew. That's what really matters," I replied, trying to maintain my composure, even with the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. "Don't forget your place," he replied, and I felt a lump form in my throat. What was supposed to be a moment of celebration turned into a bitter reminder of the hostility I faced daily. The operating room, where so many lives were saved, now felt like a battlefield, and the fight for dignity and respect was the war I was fighting. After the surgery, I went to the locker room, where the nurses were murmuring among themselves. As I passed by, I noticed that their gazes were like sharp knives, full of criticism. One of them, Nurse Jennifer, made a point of raising her voice. "I don't know how you had the courage to interrupt Dr. Andrew. He's one of the best surgeons we have. Do you really think you can put yourself above him? You better know your place," he said, with a sarcastic smile on his lips. "I care more about the patient's health than his ego," I replied, my voice firm, although fear and insecurity bubbled inside me. "If I hadn't acted, we might not be here celebrating this man's life." "You're just trying to promote yourself," another nurse added, and my heart sank. I looked in the mirror, trying to find some strength to continue. It was like the weight of the world was on my shoulders. However, before the conversation could intensify, Mr. Thomas entered the rest area. His calm appearance contrasted with the tense atmosphere. He had recovered well after surgery, and his penetrating gaze seemed to sense the hostility I faced. "Julia, can I talk to you for a moment?" he asked, with a voice that emanated a comforting calm. I felt a wave of relief that he was there to support me. "Of course, Mr. Thomas," I replied, following him to a more private corner, away from prying ears. "I saw what happened in the operating room." "You did what was right," he said, with a look of genuine approval. "Courage is a rare quality, and you demonstrated it today." "Thank you, Mr. Thomas. But it could cost me my job." "Dr. Andrew won't forget this easily," I replied, feeling the frustration return to the surface. "He may have the power now, but changes are on the way. The culture of this hospital needs to be challenged, and you are an important part of that," he stated, the determination in his words giving me a new perspective. "But what can I do? I'm just a nurse, and they're all against me." I took a deep breath, trying to contain my anguish. "Sometimes just being a nurse is all you need to be. Your voice matters, Julia. And if you need help, you're not alone. I will do what I can to support you," he said, his steady presence bringing me some comfort. "Thank you, this means a lot to me," I replied, a shy smile appearing on my face. The weight I was carrying started to feel a little lighter. Talking to him was like a balm amidst the chaos. As the conversation flowed, I couldn't help but notice that the atmosphere around me began to change. The tension that previously dominated the hospital's dynamics seemed to be being challenged. Although there was still a long way to go, Mr. Thomas's support reminded me that, behind the masks and appearances, there were people who cared and were willing to fight alongside me. As the days passed, interactions with Dr. Andrew became increasingly tense. He seemed more determined to belittle me, looking for flaws in every little detail of my work. The look of contempt he cast around me was almost palpable, and I felt like the battle was just beginning. Each day the situation felt more familiar, but I held firm. I couldn't let that get me down. Lord Edward had given me strength, and I was determined to use it. One morning, while reviewing patient charts, I found a negative comment from Dr. Have about me in a report. Anger and frustration began to build. I knew I needed to face him. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, and went to his office. "Dr. Andrew, can we talk?" I asked, feeling the tension in the air. "About what, Julia?" "About how you don't know what you're doing," he replied, with a sarcastic smile. "About your comment in the report. I found it unnecessary and unfair. I'm trying my best to do my job to the best of my ability," I stated, trying to maintain my composure. "If you don't want criticism, maybe you should reconsider your career," he snapped, and the frustration almost made me lose control. "I'm not here to discuss my career, Dr. Andrew. I'm here to work and help patients. You may not like me, but that doesn't stop me from doing my job," he said, his voice strong and clear. "Do you really think you're going to achieve anything here? The hospital is a place of hierarchy, and you're still just a newbie," he snapped. But I noticed a small crack in his confidence. "I may be young, but I have value," I replied, feeling the pressure in the air at St. Mary's General Hospital. The smell of antiseptic and the incessant sound of machines seemed distant as I prepared to speak. My heart was pounding, a mixture of anxiety and determination. Lord Edward's words echoed in my mind, encouraging me to be the voice I needed to be. He had promised me that he would not let injustice go unnoticed, and I was determined to honor that promise. I was determined to take action. It was the right time to act. Dr. Andrew was in his office, and I knew he wasn't expecting to be confronted. With firm steps, I went to the door and opened it, feeling butterflies in my stomach, but full of courage. He was sitting, reviewing some documents, and looked up at me. The expression of disdain on his face was clear. "Dr. Andrew, we need to talk about how you've been treating the employees here," I said, trying to articulate each word clearly. He let out a bitter laugh. "Do you think I care? You're just a nurse, Julia. You don't understand how things work here." At that moment, Mr. Thomas entered the room. He wasn't just a patient, it was the change I had been waiting for. He positioned himself next to me, and I instantly felt that things were about to change. "Dr. Andrew, I'm Thomas Thomas, CEO of Healthcare United," he said, his voice firm and authoritative. "I am here to discuss your discriminatory practices and the toxic culture you perpetuate at this hospital." Andrew's face paled, and I could feel the tension in the air, like a thread about to snap. He stood up, trying to regain his composure, but it was clear the situation had caught him by surprise. "This is unacceptable," Thomas continued. "The way you treat Julia and other employees is not only unethical, but it also harms the work environment and the quality of patient care. It's time for you to face the consequences of your actions. You can't just come in here and demand change," Andrew exclaimed, now nervous. "I'm the boss here." "Not for long, if you don't change your attitude," replied Thomas, with impressive calm. "I will ensure that an investigation is carried out into their practices. Employees deserve a respectful and inclusive work environment." I felt like I was floating. Finally, someone was listening. Finally, someone was standing up to Andrew on my behalf. The emotion almost made me cry, but I held firm. Adrenaline was running through my veins, and I didn't want to miss this moment. "You can't do that," Andrew shouted, now desperate. "This is an attempt to bring me down." "It's not an attempt to take you down, Dr. Andrew. It is an attempt to restore dignity and respect to all employees of this hospital," replied Thomas, with a tone full of conviction. "And I won't stop until that happens." He turned to me, a sympathetic look on his face. "Julia, you are not alone. What you are facing is unacceptable, and I will make sure that changes." I felt a wave of relief and gratitude. It was as if a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Mr. Thomas was willing to fight alongside me, and that gave me the courage I needed. "Thank you, Mr. Thomas," I managed, sincerity shining through my words. "It means a lot to me." He smiled encouragingly. "You deserve to be respected and valued for your work. Let's put an end to this culture of fear and discrimination." Andrew, now visibly shaken, shook his head. "You can't do that, Thomas. You don't know who I am. I know exactly who you are, and your position does not give you the right to mistreat others," Thomas replied firmly. "What you have done and continue to do is a disgrace to this hospital and the medical profession." I could see the anger and frustration in Andrew's eyes, but he was trapped. Thomas's presence transformed the environment, the air felt lighter, and I felt like there was finally hope. "I'm going to call a meeting with the board," Thomas continued. "We need to discuss how we are going to approach this and implement immediate changes. The culture at St. Mary's needs to change, and you, Dr. Andrew, need to be held accountable for your actions." Andrew was silent, unable to argue. His expression was one of defeat and despair, and I couldn't help but feel a mixture of satisfaction and compassion. He had been a tyrant, but now he was being confronted. "You can't do this, Thomas," he repeated, but his voice was weaker, almost a whisper. "I can, and I will," replied Thomas, turning to me. "Julia, are you ready to be heard? Do you have anything to say about what has been going on?" I felt my heart speed up again. It was my chance to be heard, to expose all the injustices I faced. He was giving me a voice in a place where I had been silenced for so long. "Yes, I have a lot of things to say," I took a deep breath, preparing to speak. "From my first day here, I was treated with contempt and disdain. No other nurse is assigned to the most difficult tasks like me. While my colleagues have lighter workloads, this isn't just about me, it's about all employees who feel afraid to speak up." Thomas nodded, encouraging me to continue. "You are not alone, Julia. Let's expose this and make sure the hospital is a safe place for everyone." Visibly uneasy, Andrew knew his actions were about to be exposed and that the protection he believed he had no longer existed. This was the moment of truth. "Patients feel it too," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "Respect for care and human dignity needs to be the priority. This should not just be a question of color or origin, but about being a professional." I felt determination grow within me, each word becoming a manifesto for change. "Competent and committed. That's an important point, Julia," agreed Thomas. "We will ensure this is included in our conversation with the board." Andrew, realizing he had no way to defend himself anymore, simply looked at us, his gaze full of disdain and anger. But I didn't care anymore. Finally, the truth was being exposed. The conversation continued, and I felt stronger with every word I said. Mr. Thomas's support was a strength I never knew I needed. He was giving me the courage to fight, not just for myself, but for all who had suffered in silence. When we finally left Andrew's office, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. What was about to happen was bigger than I could have imagined, and the change I had longed for was finally underway. I was no longer alone in the fight. The meeting room was full, and the atmosphere was filled with expectation, but the atmosphere was dense. I could feel the nervousness in the air as everyone waited for Mr. Thomas to arrive. He had requested this emergency meeting, and for the first time, I felt a little more hopeful about what might happen. The door opened and he entered, his majestic presence lighting up the room. With a firm and determined look, he walked towards the table where the most influential directors and doctors of St. Mary's General Hospital were sitting, including Dr. Andrew. "Thank you everyone for being here," began Mr. Thomas, his voice ringing with authority. Today we are here to discuss the toxic culture that permeates this hospital and the unacceptable behaviors I observed during my stay. Dr. Andrew, who was sitting at the head of the table, frowned, visibly uncomfortable. He tried to maintain a neutral expression, but I could see his arrogance was about to crumble. The atmosphere was electrified with the expectation of change. Mr. Thomas continued, "Julia Parker, a dedicated and exceptional nurse, has been the target of discrimination and hostility from some of her colleagues. What happened here," he gestured toward me, "is a reflection of a structure that needs to change." I felt my heart speed up, but at the same time a wave of gratitude enveloped me. Mr. Thomas was speaking for me, exposing the truth, a truth that I had tried unsuccessfully to make others see. I looked around and noticed that some of the directors were beginning to shift in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with what was being said. "I have witnessed not only the hostility Julia faces," he continued, "but also the lack of empathy and respect that permeates the culture of this hospital. This is not only unacceptable, it is an affront to the principles that Healthcare United stands for." Dr. Andrew, realizing that the situation was becoming untenable, began to squirm in his chair, but there was no escaping the truth that was being exposed. The room was silent, and the tension in the air was palpable. The situation at the hospital was rapidly worsening. Thomas, in his arrogant way, walked into the room and said, "You can't just do that here." Dr. Andrew, interrupting him, exclaimed, "Mr. Thomas, you don't understand. I can't expose the truth. I can't stand up for what's right." He continued, his voice growing louder, "Your approach has been discriminatory and harmful. You need to realize that your actions don't just affect you, they impact the lives of people like Julia." The atmosphere became tense, and all eyes turned to Dr. Andrew, who looked grim but said nothing. Then, Mr. Thomas took the floor again. "I am here to announce that, based on what I have witnessed, as of today you are suspended. We need an immediate change in leadership at this hospital, a change that goes beyond words." A murmur ran through the room. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Dr. Andrew, the man who had always treated me with contempt, was being challenged. When I was confronted directly, part of me felt guilty, but the other part was elated. Finally, something was changing. Mr. Thomas turned to me with an encouraging look and said, "I would like you to take on a leadership role in this hospital. I want you to be the new Chief Diversity Officer." These words penetrated me like a ray of sunlight. New Diversity Director. I never imagined I would have an opportunity like this. What once seemed like a distant dream now became a real possibility. I looked around the table, looking for reactions. Some directors seemed surprised, others intrigued. "Thomas," I started to say, but he interrupted me, "No, Julia. You deserve this." His fight was not in vain. "It's time for you to start making a difference. The change you want to see starts with you." I felt a wave of emotion invade me, remembering all the difficulties I faced. The tears I shed now seemed worth it. Dr. Andrew was out of the way and I had a real chance to do something meaningful. "I accept," I replied, my voice firm. "I'm ready to work towards a more inclusive and respectful environment." Mr. Thomas smiled, and for a moment, the tensions in the room began to dissipate. The other directors began to move around, muttering amongst themselves as if they were processing the new reality before them. "We need to implement training programs on diversity and inclusion," I continued, now more confident. "It is essential that everyone feels respected and valued, regardless of their race, gender, or any other characteristic." Mr. Thomas nodded, and I saw a gleam of approval in his eyes. He turned to the directors present and said, "I want everyone here to understand that what happened today is just the beginning. From now on, we will work together to build a better environment for everyone." Healthcare United is committed to ensuring this hospital treats everyone with dignity and respect. The change will not be easy, but it is necessary, said one of the directors. You can't just. I can and I will, interrupted Mr. Thomas, with a conviction that resonated throughout the room. What's at stake here is people's lives, and we can't ignore that. The meeting ended with a sense of renewal. The directors left one by one, and the tension that had previously dominated the atmosphere began to dissipate. I felt a little lighter, like a burden had been lifted off my shoulders. Mr. Thomas approached me and said, "I'm proud of you, Julia. From now on, you will not be alone in this fight. Let's work together to ensure St. Mary's General Hospital is a place where everyone feels welcome." "Thank you, Thomas," I replied, my voice shaking a little. This was just the beginning of a new journey. This means a lot to me and everyone who works here. You are the change we need, and I am sure you will do a great job, said Mr. Thomas. As we talked, new hope began to blossom within me. The hospital, which had once felt like a battlefield, now turned into a place where I could truly make a difference. Not only had I gained a new role, but also the chance to transform lives. That night, as I laid my head on the pillow, I couldn't help but smile. My heart was full of hope. The future looked brighter, and I was ready to face the challenges ahead. With Mr. Thomas's help and my determination, I knew we could change the hospital's culture, one step at a time. The days at St. Mary's General Hospital began to transform. Julia, now the new Chief Diversity Officer, was ready to make a difference. The new Diversity Director faced a challenge even bigger than any other, transforming the hospital's culture into a more inclusive and respectful environment. With the support of Thomas and a growing team of allies, Julia began implementing diversity and inclusion training programs. This included workshops on empathy and creating safe channels for employees to report discrimination and bias without fear of reprisal. At first, there was resistance. Some staff, including those who previously stood by Dr. Andrew, were reluctant to change. But Julia was determined. She made a point of being present at every meeting and every training session, always with an open and welcoming approach. His goal was not to punish, but to educate and inspire. Gradually, Julia began to notice changes. Small gestures that were once filled with hostility were now replaced by friendlier interactions. The environment began to transform, and hope for a better future became palpable. Nurses who had previously shunned her began coming to her for advice. Even Dr. Andrew, after a temporary suspension and mandatory training, returned to the hospital more subdued and, for the first time, willing to listen. On a sunny afternoon, Julia walked through the hospital corridors, observing the small but significant changes. He found Mr. Thomas in the recovery ward, where he was recovering well after his surgery. He smiled when he saw her, his eyes shining with pride. "You did it," he said, holding her hand firmly. "You transformed this place." Julia smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude. "I didn't do this alone. You gave me a chance, and everyone who believed in me helped make it possible." "It's just the beginning," Thomas said, looking around. "We still have a lot of work to do." Julia nodded, aware of the challenges that lay ahead, but confident that change was possible. For the first time, Julia felt like she wasn't fighting alone. The hospital was changing, and she was part of that transformation. That night, as he left the hospital in the soft glow of the sunset, his heart was full of hope. She knew the journey would be long, but every step she took was a step towards a better future, not just for herself, but for everyone who came after. When he left, he found a small, newly opened plaque at the entrance to the hospital. It read, "St. Mary General Hospital, a place of care, respect and inclusion for all." Julia smiled, a sense of accomplishment filling her heart. The path had been difficult, but she finally felt like she was in the right place, making the difference she always knew she could make. If you enjoyed Julia's journey and believe in the importance of inclusive work environments, be sure to like this video. Your like is essential for this message to reach more people. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other content. A big hug and see you next time.